Good morning, and thanks for joining us today to discover the surprising power of ideas that don't make sense. Economics and business rely on the assumption that we make logical decisions based on evidence as rational individuals. But looking at history and indeed any daily newspaper, this theory seems to lack weight. And as we will discuss today, in many crucial areas of our lives, reason plays a worryingly small part. Instead, we are driven by unconscious desires, which is why placebos are so powerful. We are drawn to the beautiful, the extravagant, and the absurd. So if you want to influence people's choices, you have to bypass reason, as the best ideas don't make rational sense. They make you feel more than they make you think. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Rory Sutherland, the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy, where he founded their behavioural practice, that looks for unseen opportunities in consumer behaviour. Rory has been president of the IPA, spoken at TED Global, and writes regular columns for The Spectator, Market Leader, and Impact. He is the author of 3 books, including the best-selling Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas Which Don't Make Sense, which we'll be shortly discussing. Briefly before we begin, I'm Charlotte Ashley, and it is my pleasure to manage the FS Club here at ZN. I'd like to warmly acknowledge our very generous sponsors who enable us to continue to bring you a wide range of thought-provoking content across finance, technology, and economics. The slides for this presentation are publicly available on our website. The session will be recorded and available to watch within 48 hours and will hold a 20-minute Q&A after the presentation. So please use the GoToWebinar chat facility to send your questions in to me early, and then I'll feed them into the conversation. Right, now the boring stuff is out of the way, I welcome you to take the virtual floor, Rory.
Perfect, and thank you very much. So where did it all start? And I'll tell you the initial story which made me a kind of behavioral economist or behavioral scientist almost avant la lettre. Because it's worth noting that back then in 1989, there wasn't any internet. There was no web, rather. There wasn't internet, but it was a almost exclusively academic pursuit. And without the internet, it was impossible to discover that this science called behavioral science was already being practiced. I'd never heard of Kahneman and Tversky until perhaps 2005, even though their work goes back to the 80s and 90s. And so I had to discover it kind of myself before there was a name for it. And for a long time, I called it That Thing for Which We Have No Name, which, by the way, at one point was the title of the book. And it started when we had a very strange BT client in what my agency was then called, which was Ogilvy and Mather Direct. And we were selling things which are now called network services, they're sometimes called star services, effectively enhancements to your home telephone, which were made possible by connection to a digital exchange, where you could pay us a few pounds a month or pay BT a few pounds a month and gain access to things like call diversion, call waiting, three-way calling and such like. And we wrote to people, described these services, explained the price, and then merely said, if you would like to enable these on your home phone, you can either telephone this free phone number, 0800 blah, 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 or tick the box at the bottom of this letter, put it in the free post envelope enclosed, and send it back to us. End of. And we were doing very nicely. But then the client had a very weird objection, which we'd never really anticipated, which was, he said, why the hell are we giving money to the post office? We're trying to promulgate a kind of telephone culture in this country. And in any case, I want our call center staff to be kept as busy as possible, possibly so he could build a call center empire within BT. So why don't we just offer them the phone number and get rid of the free post envelope? And we said, because it was the right thing to say, yes, okay, but let's test it first. And so we selected 50,000 fresh customers at random, 3 groups of 50,000, 150,000 fresh new customers who'd never been sent anything before. And we sent each 50,000 a different approach. One was phone only, one was post only, okay, and the other one, as before, offered the recipient the choice of either replying by phone or by post. And the results were kind of freakish. Phone only got a response rate of about 2%. Post only got a response rate of 5%. When you offer, now that's pretty weird in itself. So I know economists aren't blind to the idea of transaction costs, but the fact that the difference between two reply media for a one-off purchase for a subscription product, the idea that that should have a 2.5 times effect on response seems a bit weird. You'd think, either you want this damn thing or you don't, and the mode of response should be fairly much immaterial. Okay. Then the weirdest thing of all, which is that when you offer people the choice of phone and post, the response rate was near as, damn it, within a fraction of a percent, 7%, which was the sum total of the other two. Okay, now when you think about that, that is really weird, because it actually suggests that the biggest determinant of whether you buy this product or not isn't how much it costs or whether you want it, but the mode by which you can request it, the channel by which you can request it. And I remember making the comment at the time, well, the only suggestion I can make for these findings is that we add a third option, which is to reply by fax, and we should get another 1% on top. And by the way, this finding holds true across quite a lot of behavioral economics experiments. Now, what's interesting about it? One, it runs completely counter to anything which you might consider economic rationality, where the principal determinant of reply would be what the thing is, whether it adds utility to the person receiving the letter, and how much they have to pay for it. No, this huge factor was determined by the mode of response. I mean, literally, how weird is that? And from then on, I kind of dedicated myself to trying to discover as many counterintuitive behavioral findings as you could, until happily, this was 1989, 1990, until happily, about 15 to 20 years later, I discovered there were actually some academics who are equally fascinated as me by the same thing. What's also interesting about that is not only that the behavior defies rationality, but I'm fairly confident in saying, I think, that the behavior is entirely unconscious in its influence. In that, had you asked all of the people who'd replied by post, the 7%, okay, and said, can you give us the reasons why you replied for this product? Almost all of them would have cited something to do with value for money, price. I run a business, so it's useful to be able to divert my calls to a mobile phone, whatever it might be. I'm pretty confident that not a single person, and yet bear in mind this was 5/7 of the recipient base in many ways, not a single person would have said it was because I could reply by post. So it's patently people being inordinately influenced by something which is absolutely opaque to introspection. It's not available to consciousness. And this brings me, I suppose, to one of the most interesting findings of behavioral science, expressed by one anthropologist in the phrase, we are not, as humans, a rational species, we're a post-rationalizing species. That when we do anything, however actually emotional, unconscious, seemingly bizarre our real motivation might be, we will always reverse engineer a story where the reasons for our actions were entirely rational. And this applies particularly, I think, in business decision making. Now, the consequence of the human facility for post-rationalizing absolutely anything, okay, is that we give far more credit to rationality than it deserves. And we effectively depict rationality as playing a much greater role in human decision making than is really accurate. That's the first point. There's a second reason why rationality is overrated. It's a little like the way I describe that, it's a perceptual asymmetry, okay? If you do something for an emotional reason, and then you provide a rational reason, you forget anything emotional about the decision, and the rational post hoc reverse engineered explanation becomes in your mind the one true explanation for your behavior. Okay, now that's one reason when I say no famous Belgians, there are lots of famous. It's a joke that there aren't very many famous Belgians. Of course, there's Hercule Poirot, who's a fictional detective, and there's Tintin, who's an imaginary cartoon character, and I suppose you could include Jean-Claude Van Damme, but basically there aren't very many famous Belgians. Actually, there are. It's just that when you become famous and you're Belgian, everybody thinks you're French. The one exception would be great artists. If you're a great artist and you're Belgian, everybody describes you as Flemish. And so it's a similar asymmetry, okay? We do things for a mix of emotional and some rational reasons, okay? We rewrite the explanation entirely in rational language, and the emotional component then gets lost to memory or awareness, okay? Now, in the same way, what we've started to do in business, and I think we've never looked for the downside of this, is we use the rationality and quality of decision making as a proxy for the quality of the decision. Now, really, the only measure of the quality of a decision in any business setting is really the outcome. But if things go wrong, the consequences for the decision maker, if they appear to have made the decision rationally, will be inordinately less severe than if they simply make the decision subjectively. I would argue that perhaps 25% of all business activity, or even more, is really arse covering disguised as rigor. In other words, if I have a really sound case involving market research, data, etc., for doing what I'm doing, well, one, okay, it's not a totally terrible thing. I'm not suggesting you should ignore data, ignore market research, or anything like that. But if I deviate from the logical conclusion from that information, the extent to which I expose myself to blame, censure, or getting fired is much, much higher in the event of failure than if I'm entirely rational in what I do. Even if the rational solution, to be honest, isn't all that great. And so in any institutional setting, we are biased towards treating quality of decision making and decision making rigor as if it's actually a reliable proxy for the quality of decision. Why might it not be? Now, words in English always tend to deviate between a more extreme meaning. Awful, which used to mean something completely different, now means terrible. And we tend to attach to words either a positive or a negative connotation. Okay? So words which we should treat as ambiguous, we tend to make either effectively a vehicle for praise or a vehicle for criticism. I was discussing this, fun enough, with a few people in the property industry, and I said, you know, when you think about it, a really complicated word is gentrification. Because gentrification can be good or bad. A small amount of gentrification is probably desirable in a poor area because it brings in money and probably brings in businesses where other people have more freedom to spend and more freedom of choice. Complete gentrification, where you evict the poor, is probably pretty undesirable. And yet, depending on the speaker, gentrification will occasionally be used as a, entirely as a kind of a term of praise, but more often than not, particularly if you have, someone who's politically motivated, gentrification has now become a term of opprobrium. When you look at the word rational, okay, rational and its opposite, irrational, are very, very heavily charged. Okay, rational basically means good, irrational basically means silly. Now, since in most business contexts, you're dealing with consumers and human beings who do not use rationality as the principal determinant of the decisions they make, you might argue that something that's rational always falls danger to being misaligned with what consumers are looking for. So being rational in terms of, I can explain this to the board, I can explain this to my colleagues, I can explain this to the finance director, may mean that you're designing a product that would appeal to the finance director's theoretical model of himself. By the way, finance directors are no more, as consumers, finance directors are no more rational than anybody else. But in a business setting where you have to justify your decision to other people, which most of the time consumers don't have to do, being rational may cause a fundamental problem of alignment, because you're writing things that appeal to an imaginary rational human being, sometimes called Homo economicus, rather than designing the world for the people who really inhabit it. That's one problem, a downside. And if I say the downside of rationality, many people will look at me as if I'm completely insane. How could there possibly be a downside to being rational? Well, there is, and there are several major downsides about using conventional rational induction based on available data to make your decisions. Okay? In fact, there are quite a few. The first one, I would argue, is it tends to be, on average, a reasonably good outcome will arrive from a rational decision, but you probably won't get a breakthrough. So rationality leads you to relatively low variance, high cost incremental improvements. One of the reasons why it does this is one of the first assumptions people make when they're trying to be rational is effectively the idea of trade-offs, okay? Which is, yes, you can make something better, but only at a cost. There tends to be this assumption, which we've borrowed from mainstream economics, which is generally, if you want to produce a high quality automobile, you need to spend more money on quality control at the end of the production line. And for a long time, that was kind of true until Toyota came along. And after a few years of Kaizen manufacturing, the two highest quality automobiles in the world were a top of the range Mercedes, which had 48 people doing quality control on the car, and the mainstream Toyota family car, which had nobody doing quality control because the quality control was baked into the process. But rational people tend to like what you might call a cost-benefit analysis and the assumption of trade-offs, because then you can draw a nice little graph and decide where the top point should be in the middle. And it gives you a definitive and decisive right answer. Now, one thing that happens as soon as you abandon the idea that decision-making must be rational is you have to abandon the idea that there's a single right answer. You have to accept the fact that there might be multiple right answers. And you have to accept the idea, bizarrely, that, for example, sometimes the opposite of a good idea might not be stupid, it might be another good idea. And that makes people uncomfortable, because what they want to do as a decision maker in an institutional setting is do what you do when you do GCSE maths. This, therefore, this, therefore, this, therefore, this, therefore, that, QED, that is the only right answer. Everything else is, by definition, therefore, wrong. And people justifying decisions in a business setting want to create that kind of narrative, because at that point everybody gives you a big tick and everything proceeds. No further debate, Fothergill's come up with the right answer. Now, so one thing that tends to happen when you're rational, because of this assumption in trade-offs, is that you tend to get low variance outcomes. Yeah, I think on balance they're probably positive, but you're not going to get a breakthrough that way. And the reason is that the breakthroughs happen when you stumble on magic. And logic doesn't allow for magic. Marketing does allow for magic. Those of you in financial services might have been driven insane by the popularity of Santander's 3-2-1 financial product. Okay, you would argue that objectively it's not as good as other products you offer. Maybe not, but psychologically, or using psychologic, the great thing about that Santander product is concretization. The brain can immediately get its head around what I get out of this thing, whereas most people don't even understand compounding, okay? So that's the first point I'm making here, which is that logical answers tend to be low variance outcomes. Maybe that's what you want, okay? You know, to be honest, you know, if you're some weird brand like, for example, Tide, and you've got 80% of the US laundry detergent market, you don't want to do anything high variance. But if you're a smaller business, if you're a challenger business, the only way you're going to win is really by doing things, is by discovering a bit of magic, discovering something that doesn't quite make sense, but which has disproportionate effects in proportion to the cost of the input. Okay, and that's probably something psychological. Don't think, by the way, that when you do that, anybody will give any credit to magic. No, because they'll post-rationalize it and pretend it was logical all along. You know, everybody will go and say, including James Dyson himself, of course, the vacuum cleaner is most popular because it doesn't lose suction and because it's bagless. Are we sure? Okay, let's put it another way as a marketer. Okay, do we think that if James Dyson had made those vacuum cleaners boring looking, beige and opaque, rather than really cool and transparent, do we think that that they would have walked off the shelves in the way they did? Or without the emotional reward of actually seeing the dirt accumulate in the cylinder, which is a feedback thing which human beings always find disproportionately pleasurable. I would argue Dyson is as much a psychological, irrational success as a product as it is a product of superior engineering. How do we know how good it is at suction anyway? Most of us don't do an A-B comparison, right? One of the other disadvantages with rationality, it doesn't differentiate you much. That's another reason, because most of your competitors are also being fairly rational. And therefore, when you end up in the same place, the same competitive space, the same area of comparison as all your other competitors, you end up in kind of red water, bloodied strategy of direct competition, under which circumstances it's very difficult to make any money. That's problem number two. It doesn't differentiate you, and it generally tends to force you to compete on the same measures and benchmarks that everybody else is using, which is just damn difficult and not very lucrative. A third problem, by the way, all big data comes from the same place, the past. Okay, now the first lesson of statistics is that if you have an unrepresentative data set, you have to compensate. That your confidence in statistics, or the extent to which you take them literally, must be compensated by the extent to which they're unrepresentative. And planning for the future on the basis that the future is a mere extrapolation of the past is a completely unsafe thing, even in favorable conditions. If you've just had something major like a pandemic followed by a cost of living crisis, the idea that you should optimize on the past or construct models for the future that have been derived entirely from past data and past behavior seems fundamentally unsafe. So those are three reasons why we really want to be a bit skeptical about rationality. Because in many, many cases, I think, put it this way, there are far more good ideas we can post-rationalize than there are good ideas we can pre-rationalize. What's happened with humans is our facility at post-rationalizing has deluded us into believing that the same process works just as well in advance as it does in retrospect. It really doesn't. Okay, I'll give you an extraordinary case in point. If you, I wanted to do this experiment for years, except for the fact that it was both illegal and unethical. It was to put, let's say, McCann oven fries, okay, put 50% extra free on the bag, and then put the price up by 50%. Now, obviously, it's completely illegal. You're lying, okay? You are putting 50% extra in, but it isn't free. But the reason I wanted to do it is I wanted to see how much of a promotion drove success through the price mechanism, and how much of a promotion drove success perhaps through some other mechanism like choice architecture, which is when in doubt, buy the one on deal, okay? Or the concretization of, ooh, I'm getting a load of this for free. Now, I could obviously never do that experiment, but funnily enough, I met someone not from McCain who told me the results. I said, how on earth can you know? It's completely unethical and completely illegal. He said, of course, but we run hundreds and thousands of these promotions every year, and a few times a year, we make a mistake. And we put the volume up, but we put the price up commensurately. What happens? He said, I can't give you the data for obvious reasons. Let me just put it like this. You wouldn't believe how much money we make. So now, to an economist, 50% extra free, extra sales is just, greater utility per pound, greater sales, price demand curve, move along, nothing to see here. Actually, I still think there's something to see here psychologically, because even though they behave as if they were influenced by economic principles, actually it could as much be the red flash on the bag that drives the activity, and just the ease of decision making, which is when I'm presented with 4 indistinguishable alternatives, I'll choose the one on deal, that probably drives the behavior rather than any calculus of utility versus price. And so in everything we do, much, much more is driven by irrational and psychological factors than is driven by the idea of, which we mostly hold dear and hold close to, which is entirely rational and objective human beings making utility optimizing decisions. And it's further complicated by the fact that our perception of almost anything is relative and emotional. It's not objective and rational. And so I'll end, because I'm coming up to the end now, about 20 minutes before we go into questions. I'll end with a perfect example of behavioral science being used to brilliant effect. So there was an insurance company which was being bombarded with complaints and generally panicked phone calls in their call center because they'd agreed to pay an insurance claim and the check hadn't arrived. Okay? Now, the literal-minded, logical person infers from that one thing, okay? Without delving any deeper into human psychology, without asking a few questions like why 5 times or what is really going on here, the rational person says, we need to send our checks out faster. And indeed, that is what the company set out to do, despite the fact there were negative implications for cash flow, and it was going to cost them operationally quite a lot of money to process checks and post them faster. Until someone with a vague grip of psychology finally came along and said this. What they said is, in the human brain, there's no such thing as fast and slow. There's faster than you expect and slower than you expect. We perceive things in contrast to expectation, not as an absolute. Secondly, those people are not ringing up because they think that the check is too slow. They're ringing up because naively, when they were told you'd pay the check, they expected it to arrive in 1 or 2 days, and they're basically paranoid that it's been lost in the post. They may be wanting to know what day it will arrive so they can kind of wait up for it, but their fear is, they said they'd send me my claim check and it still hasn't arrived after 3 days, therefore it must have gone missing in the post, because they were assuming that when the person said your claim is approved, that was when the check went out. So this guy said, based on those 2 psychological insights, here's what you do, okay? When you agree to pay a claim, how long do you pay a claim in the moment? And they said something like 9 days. He said, very simple, okay? He said, when you agree to pay a claim, you in future will tell them that they should expect their claim check in 2 weeks or 2 to 3 weeks. I can't remember which it was. Nothing had changed about the objective reality. All you'd changed is the expectation. What happened was the panicked phone calls completely dried up. People weren't frightened their check had gone missing because they'd been told it would be sent in 2 to 3 weeks. When they eventually sent the check out in 7 to 8 days, they did start receiving a trickle of phone calls, this time from very, very happy customers, thanking them for sending the check so quickly, i.e. faster than expected. My contention is, once we abandon the idea that we have to pretend every business problem is Newtonian physics, and that the quality of reasoning and rationality that led us to the solution is a reliable proxy for the quality of our solution. If we can choose moments where we say, let's look for the rational solution here, but let's also put a shadow team looking for other ways to solve the problem, or even other ways to define the question, okay? What you will do is you will expand your solution space enormously. Yes, the non-rational solutions have a slightly greater unexpected level of outcome. Yes, when they do pay off, they can pay off spectacularly and disproportionately well, okay? But finally, there are far more of them than there are rational solutions. And by expanding the solution space that way, by the admission that rationality isn't necessarily the perfect benchmark to evaluate decisions with, what you end up with is a much bigger solution space and therefore a much bigger chance of a breakthrough. It's difficult to do. I think you should do the two in parallel, by the way, and finally end up asking the question, what makes us think the slightly weird solution might be an order of magnitude better than the sensible one? But nonetheless, I think people should do it, because if we confine our possible actions to those we can justify immediately, okay, a large number of the great discoveries will never be made. Or, I'll put it another way, okay, if there were a rational solution to your problem, someone would have probably found it already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rory. It certainly reminds me of that advice. You should always under-promise and over-deliver. I think that helps a lot. We do have a lot of questions here. So going back to your example at the start about BT, Neil Brown has just asked for clarification. Did the 7% split 5% post and 2% phone?
Yes. So that's a very good question. More or less, I know that there was a significant majority, and we debated this. Is it just because, you know, if you're sitting there with a pen, you reply by post? You know, if you aren't sitting there with a pen, if you're sitting next to the phone, maybe you reply by phone. I don't know. One of the questions we asked, by the way, is a more interesting psychological one about choice architecture, which is that when you give people a choice of how to reply, once they've decided to buy the product, they're now on to thinking, do I post it or do I phone it in? And now they're no longer thinking about, do I need this product at all? So there's a possible choice architecture thing in design, a bit like, okay, if any of you have credit card, you know, products, right? If at the very bottom of the application you put something like, how would you like your name to appear on the card? There's a hunch that you might get a higher response rate, because once they've signed the thing, okay, they're now thinking about, do I want to be Mr. Rory Sutherland or Rory Sutherland or Rory Sutherland Esquire or whatever, okay? And they're no longer thinking about whether they want the product at all. Their brain's moved on. That's one theory. The other one is just that emotionally we have such a strong disposition, but roughly speaking, I'm not sure it was exactly 5-2. It's a really great question to ask, and I should know the answer. In sympathy, okay, I can never find the exact data because this was in 1989 and it's all since been burnt, and I only have my memory to go on. But from what I can vaguely remember, the ratio of responses was always, this is why it was so strange for the guy to say, why are we giving all our money to the post office? The ratio of responses was always weighted about 2-to-1 or more towards the post.
On that, Richard Harvey has said that he thinks many people fancied the product, but some were deterred from buying it due to the perceived hassle of responding by phone or post. And he likens it to the fact that he routinely avoids cafes that accept only cash, even if the food is tasty, because he can't be bothered with cash.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is interesting in itself, which is that it's probably a little similar to the peak end rule, which is if you think the transaction up front is painful, to an economist, that would be an extreme case of what you might call asynchronous time preference. that the thing I have to do, it's a bit like saying, would you like to pay contactlessly and have someone stick pins in your legs, or would you like to pay with cash and have someone bring you a nice cup of tea, and you go, oh god, I hate the bloody, but actually the next step of a journey and how painful it might be could exert a disproportionate influence on our propensity to proceed. That's why sometimes the clever way to design application forms is to get the difficult bit over with first, but sometimes it's to leave the difficult bit till last. It's complicated. But what you wouldn't expect if you believed in mainstream economics is that you would expect an effect, because good economists would say, no, there are transaction costs, and some people just, hate going to the post box, and some people hate waiting for someone to answer the phone. But you wouldn't expect it to have an inordinate effect on people's propensity to order the product or not. Although, I will say this, if you could find an easier way of buying cars that didn't involve so much paperwork and bureaucracy, okay, if you could buy a car on Klarna, I think that the car industry would do considerably better.
And Rupert Stubbs has asked, what do you see as the implications of ergodicity economics on behavioural economics?
Bloody hell. Someone's been reading every detail. To be honest, it's simply that when we develop models, we tend to average. Now, two things. Actually, we talk about big data far too much. There's a great book, and I'll really recommend it to everybody, called Algorithms to Live By I think it's Brian Christian and somebody Griffith. But they make the point that actually, if you're intelligent, you can extract quite a lot of big data from within small data. Even within a remarkably small data set, you can actually start to derive quite a lot of information. Now, big data is valuable if you want to do personalization, because you have data on everybody and you don't have to rely on something like segmentation as a proxy, okay? So big data in pure direct marketing is kind of valuable, and it may be valuable if you want to attribute the success of communications. But the problem with big data is that you tend to end up averaging it or adding it to make sense of it. And what ergodicity is an example of is bad averaging, okay? Where you assume that the ensemble probability of something is equivalent to the time series probability. And I use much more childish examples where I simply make the point that we tend to assume things are commutative when they're not. So, well, I'll give you a perfect example of that, okay? If you piss off 3 customers once and then solve the problem, okay, it's perfectly survivable to do that on a large scale as an organization year after year after year. If you piss off one person 3 times in a row, it's fundamentally different, okay? The degree of pissed offness is different. And so it would be sensible for people looking at customer satisfaction to consider the question much more longitudinally. And I always argue that all organizations underinvest in call centers, and here's the reason, okay? In the modern world, what's probably happened is the consumers had a problem. They've got online to try and fix the problem, and they haven't found an answer to their problem. That's the second problem. Now, if you ring up the call center and they make you wait for 3 minutes or 10 minutes, it's a third problem. And then if they don't solve your problem, you've now hit 4 problems in a row. Looked at like that, you would spend much more on call centers than you currently do, where you treat each call center call as though it's an incident in isolation. But another argument was simply assuming things are commutative. Now, what Nassim Taleb would call this is a hidden asymmetry. And in fact, the subtitle of one of Nassim's book was Uncovering the Hidden Asymmetries in Everyday Life. I'll give you a couple of hidden asymmetries, okay, which only emerge when you think in kind of both dimensions, when you do the what Mark Ritson calls the 90-degree flip, okay? You think about the problem from a chronological perspective, not an aggregate snapshot perspective. One of them is High Speed 2. High Speed 1 is a great success because it enables a lot of people who live in Canterbury or Margate or Ramsgate or Folkestone or Ashford, okay, to save, if they travel into London, let's say 200 times a year, or that might be 400, journeys in total, they might be saving 30 minutes 400 times a year. That's a really, really big deal. Okay, one person saving 40 minutes 200 times a year is a massive change. The time savings in aggregate would look the same if you're talking about high speed 2, which is closer to being 200 people saving 40 minutes, or 100 people saving 40 minutes twice a year, or maybe 50 people saving 40 minutes on a journey 4 times a year, or whatever. Okay, now the total amount of time saved, okay, is the same, but the first one is a life changer. Oh, look, dear, we can move to Canterbury. Okay, the second one, although the amount of time saved overall is the same, is merely a mild convenience for a wide number of people, but it's not a game changer. I'm not, I might move to Canterbury because of high speed 1. I'm not going to move to Manchester because of high speed 2, because it'll be too expensive to commute. And I don't think anybody's ever going to gets up in the morning and goes, there are people who get up in the morning and say, I would move to Canterbury, but it would be 80 minutes of extra commuting time if I did it pre-high speed 1. I don't think there are many people who get up in the morning and go, I would go to Manchester today, but it takes 40 minutes too long. And so the art of what happens when you have big data is you start averaging and you start assuming symmetries. And when you do that, what happens actually, when you start assuming smoothness, linearity, and symmetry, okay, is you start missing what's really important. In other words, the thing that makes human experience different from one person to another.
We've got another question here from Hugh Purser. He said, is there a noticeable gender difference in the use of rationality in decision making, or a cultural difference around the world with the same process? Not relying on...
Brilliant question, by the way. And it's also worth looking at books like Weird, which stands for, it stands for The Weirdest People in the World, is the title of the book. And it stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich and Democratic. And a criticism of quite a lot of behavioral science is that it's generally performed by people in typically university graduates originally, or graduate students in weird countries, in weird settings. Okay. There have been efforts made quite rightly to correct this, and the discoveries have been interesting. A large part of this is universal, but a significant part of it is acculturated. Now, you probably know those things, I think it's called the Lyell illusion, where you have two lines, and two of the lines, they're all the same length, but some of them end in arrows, and some of them end with the arrows splayed outwards. And everybody comes to believe that the splayed outwards lines are longer than the arrow lines, okay? It turns out this illusion doesn't work if you try it on people who've grown up in round buildings. It's something we learn to do with our eyes because we've spent a lot of time living inside cubes and cuboids and so on. That illusion, that perceptual illusion, doesn't apply if you've lived in round mud huts or igloos at all. Interesting, quite a lot of the failure to replicate in behavioral science, it should be said, is contextual. Okay, I do believe in the paradox of choice, that if you make choice too baffling or your choice architecture is bad, you will fail to sell to people because they can't confidently make a decision. Okay, I believe in that. I don't believe it applies everywhere. So if you're a bit time poor, you're not that sure about whether to buy jam or not, and you're offered 47 types of jam, I think you're more likely to buy no jam at all than if you're offered 7. On the other hand, if you've just driven with your family 15 or 20 miles to go and visit an out-of-town mega store called World of Jam, right? I don't think you turn up and go, oh, it's just too much jam, I can't cope with it. So obviously the mindset within which we approach a problem and the context within which the problem is presented will also have a bearing on our decisions. So in many ways, you wouldn't expect behavioral science experiments to replicate that reliably. Now, the good news for business people is if you're a scientist or an academic, what you want to do is come up with something which is universally true, okay? If you want to run a business, if something is surprising and merely true of some people some of the time, that insight can be perfectly enough to sustain a business without it having to be a universal.
Right, we're almost out of time, but we've got a couple more interesting questions. We'll see if we can get through. Anne-Marie Kinlock said that she's a small brand and she'd really like to understand what you said their differentiator needs to be psychological. So how might a small brand create a psychological difference? Do you have any examples?
I'll recommend another book because I'm reading this at the moment. And just let me be clear, I started recommending this book to other people long before someone told me that he mentions my book towards the end of his book favorably. So this isn't a kind of reciprocation bias among authors. But it's one good idea, okay, and it involves a small amount of irrationality, is what's sometimes called Kano theory, from not from the rapper, but from a Japanese academic at the University of Tokyo. And it's brilliantly captured, I think, in a book which has just come out from a very successful restaurant manager in New York called Unreasonable Hospitality, the name of the author being Will Guidara. So it's Will, Guidara. And one of his rules is what he calls the 95-5 rule. Run your restaurant 95% of the time as if you're an accountant. But 5% of the time, know when to indulge in a gratuitous extravagance. Okay? Meaningful inefficiency is where you should strive for the 5%. So the example Guidara gives is that he had to open a gelateria in the courtyard of MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And he went to a brilliant gelateria and negotiated hard a very heavily discounted rate on their fantastic quality gelato. And then he comes across these spoons, tiny blue spoons, manufactured by an Italian designer specifically for eating ice cream. Okay, and they are, he doesn't quote the amount, they are almost fantastically expensive. And everybody tries to get him to abandon the spoons, and he goes, no, the spoons are non-negotiable here. They're part of my 5%. Okay, and companies that don't do the 5% kind of look mean. And he makes the point that how do I justify the spoons? Well, I can't, because it's subjective, except for the fact that everybody who buys the ice cream almost comments on or falls in love with the spoons. Okay. The second point is, he said, you only need about 3 or 4% of people to buy a second ice cream because they like the spoon so much, or indeed they wanted to take the spoon home with them. Okay. You only need a small percentage of people. Now, you'll never be able to measure to what extent the spoon contributed to repeat purchase, but nonetheless, he believes that you should 5% of the time you should abandon all the usual constraints that apply to businesses and engage in what he calls unreasonable hospitality. And I think it's a fantastic book to read, which has applications way beyond the restaurant space. I mean, the example I always give of a 5% is the DoubleTree cookie when you check in. The first, you'll know you've got this right when it makes your finance director angry.
We're out of time, but I just want you to touch on one more thing before we go. And apologies if I got to your question today. We will send them all directly to Rory so he can get in touch with you. Okay. But just wondering here, John Knights has said, what is the role and importance of ethics in all of this, which is also often subconscious?
Of ethics, do you mean?
Ethics, yeah.
Right. Not a bad model for anything you do. Actually, I don't believe in models because they're always, they always contain, inaccuracies. What I do believe in, as do pilots, is checklists. And one really interesting thing is a checklist by a guy called David Rock, who's a neuroscientist in New York, and he calls it the SCARF model. of things that are almost impossible to quantify or measure, and which therefore get kind of neglected by businesses, for instance, but which are inordinately important to human emotion. And the 5 mnemonic components of SCARF are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness. I'd call that recognition or reciprocation, actually, but he calls it relatedness, and fairness. And understanding, of course, the perception of fairness in financial services, for example. One fairly strong principle of fairness, which I think applies to things like overdraft charges when you think about it, is there's a very, very strong human instinct that you don't kick people when they're down. In other words, there's a very strong ethical instinct that I'll give you an interesting example of this. There's a paper written in 1690, I think, by John Locke, and it's on the idea of the just price. And his contention is that if you own a horse which has a market value of, let's say, £10, but you particularly like the horse, okay, so you wouldn't really sell it for £12, it's not unethical for you to refuse to sell the horse for less than £12. You're not obliged to sell at the market rate. But, and this is a big, big but if someone comes along who's desperate to visit their dying father, okay, and they say, I desperately need a horse, how much do you want for yours? It is unethical to charge them £20. You charge them 12. In other words, to use the knowledge of someone else's misfortune to charge them money is widely seen as just wrong. And so, you know, there are all sorts of ethical dilemmas which used to appear around that. For example, ships used to carry 2 anchors, because if you only had 1 anchor and you lost it, which happened fairly frequently, there was a very high chance that the ship might end up getting blown onto the rocks. And there was just an ethical understanding among sailors that if you've got 2 anchors and you encounter another ship that's got 0, you don't ask them a stupid amount of money for one of your 2 anchors. Because to use knowledge of someone else's powerlessness to make money for yourself is fundamentally seen as unfair.
Indeed, but many still do that, don't they? But
economists wouldn't understand the distinction. They just go, the anchor's worth what anybody's prepared to pay for it. Bad luck.
So yeah, we do need ethics and economics, don't we? But that was really, really enjoyable. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today, Roy. I think we need to get you back to continue these discussions. I'll definitely be adding your book to my holiday reading list. And also, once again, thanks to our wonderful sponsors for making these webinars possible, I should say, and also to our inquisitive and intelligent audience for all your time and contributions today. Do check out our forthcoming events program on the website. We do have a lot more events coming up this week, and we'll continue to bring you very stimulating content throughout the year. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.